Welcome back to Now Just Kings, guys. I am Kings, and this video is the second video in our Building Basics series. If you are new and haven't seen the first video, feel free to check it out. In the last video, I talked about the importance of the red numbers on the tape measure as well as the diamonds. This is what I will be covering today, and with that, I will be explaining what the phrase on center means. For example, 16 inches on center, 1 foot on center, or 19.2 on center. Now with this video, I will be explaining in part laying out a wall as I would if I were going to build a house, but I will not be going into it in great detail as this video is focusing on the phrase on center. I will make a video in the future covering wall layout in detail as well as parts of the wall. So on to 16 inches on center. Let's get to it. Okay, so I have a 2x4 here that'll represent the bottom plate of a wall. Now I need to put studs in this wall to hold my sheeting, and that makes up the frame of the wall. And to do that, they need to be put on a certain layout. That's where the 16 inches on center comes in. So at the start of my wall, I'm going to have a stud, represented with an X. That means one stud is going there. Now we don't typically mark the other side of a stud, but there it is, 1.5 inches, and that's a stud. Now my next stud, coming from the end of the wall, needs to be 16 inches to the center of the stud. So this is going to be the center of a stud. A C with a line through it is a center. Now a stud is 1.5 inches. So if my center is at 16, I need to go back 3/4 of an inch, half the distance of a stud, and that's the edge of my stud. And then we mark it with an X. So typically, that's how you would lay out one stud, with a line falling back 3/4 from your center and putting an X. Okay, you can also jump ahead 3/4 of an inch and make a line and put an X. Or you could do both, but there's your whole stud right there with a line on each side. And the center is 16 inches. Okay, now let's go over one more stud over. Okay, now at 32, we're going to do the same thing. We want the center coming from the end to be 32 inches from the end. And here's the center, and we're going to fall back 3/4 again. Like I said, you could also go ahead 3/4 of an inch and put a line. Typically, we don't mark both, we just fall back 3/4 and make an X. What you don't want to do is get in the habit of on 16 you fell back 3/4, on 32 you went ahead 3/4 and only had one mark. That'll get confusing for when someone's nailing the wall together. But if you put marks on both sides, that would eliminate any confusion. Now we don't typically do that because when you're framing a house, you want to go as fast as you can, and doubling the amount of marks that you have to make would take a little bit longer. Okay, so 32 is the same. Now going over to 48 inches. At 48 inches, we're again going to do the same thing. 48 inches, center, and fall back 3/4, half the distance of our stud. Okay, this is why this is so important. Our sheets of OSB that we put on the wall are 48 inches wide. So when you lay your sheet onto this wall, now the sheet will be half on the stud, and so the next sheet can also be half on the stud. So both sheets, when they come together, will have a place to get nailed. And that's why we do 16 inches on center. Okay, so you saw from the full stud on the end, we have 48 inches to the center, 32 inches to the center, okay? But our dimension from the edge of one stud to the edge of another stud is 16 inches, which means that from the center of this stud to the center of the next stud is 16 inches. That's where we get 16 on center. So from the edge of the first stud to the other one, it will be 15.25. That's the only one that will be off from that 16 inches on center measurement. From all the other ones, if I hook one stud and go, all the other ones are on 16 inches on center. So this is what you can do. You can grab a hammer and a nail, and I'm going to put the point of the nail just off to the side so that when the nail gets hammered in, the edge of the nail is the edge of my line. I don't want to put the point right on the line because then my measurement will be just a little bit off. So I'm going to put this in, and on your tape measure, it has this little hole right there, and that's for hooking it around the head of the nail. Now it can pivot around there. Okay, if I do that, now you can see I'm 16 inches. I can now lay out this whole thing, just putting a mark right on every single 16-inch mark, all the red marks. Put a mark, then put an X, and just keep going all the way down the line. Okay, so now we're at 8 feet, which we made a mark at. Let's pretend that this board ends right here. Like, let's say this part of the wood is gone, and I'm using a cutoff to finish a top plate, or a bottom plate, or whatever we're laying out, and I need to have a longer section. Well, I can't put a stud right here if this is where this ends, because a sheet won't land on there, a piece of OSB or plywood, whatever we're using. So what I need to do is cut this off so that the cut is going to be right in the center of a stud. So I have my 8 feet. What I'm going to do is move over 3/4, half the distance of my stud. 1, 2, 3. And this is where I'm going to make my cut. Okay. I'm not going to cut it because we're going to be using this in the shed project here in a bit. Not this video, but a future video. But that's where I would cut it off, and then I would start my layout again from there. So that would look like if we pulled this board over, this would now we'd be starting from here and starting our layout again. And as you can see, that's what we did. Coming from the end, we go to 16 center and fall back. And that's what we have. Continue on, and that's where we get our measurements from. Same on the 4-foot mark, fall back 3/4, half the distance. Okay, but now, what if you're doing something that's not a 2x4 for a stud? What if we're using floor trusses that are 3.5 inches wide? I'll flip this over and we'll start here. So if I had floor trusses that were 3.5 inches and I need 16-inch centers, okay, my first X would be represented here. So this is the first floor truss. Then I'm pulling from this end, going over to the center. Now I need to do half of 3.5. So that's inch and 1, 2, 3/4. So now I'm falling back 1 3/4 inches. You're always falling back half the distance of whatever it is that you need your plywood to land on. Or, like I said before, you could go forward 1 inch and 1, 2, 3/4. Okay, and then for the next one, same thing, 32, fall back inch, 1, 2, 3/4, and there's your mark. Or, man, that's annoying. Or if we pull from the last mark that we made, it will now be 16 inches on center. So even though our boards are significantly wider, because our measurements are from center to center, 16 inches, that means from left edge to left edge will be 16 inches, and right edge to right edge will be 16 inches. So essentially any point on one stud, floor joist, floor truss, whatever, to the same point on the other one will be 16 inches on center. The only one where that'll be different on is the very first one. You can see in between here we have 12.5 inches in between, whereas in here we have 10 3/4. Essentially the 1 inch and 1, 2, 3/4 difference, because a sheet doesn't land halfway on the start of your layout, it lands on the end. Whereas here, your sheet will end at 4 feet on the center. Here's the center, and that's your 3.5 inches. So now I'm just going to set some studs in here so you can see what that will look like. Okay, so now that I have the studs in place, you can see exactly what 16 inches on center looks like. And again, our 4 feet lands right here, which is how wide our sheeting is. Okay, now we talked about floor trusses being on center, and the floor trusses that I typically work with, they are this wide, 3.5 inches wide, because they're made out of 2x4s on the tops. Okay, And for a layout for floor trusses, 16 inches on center would be very close. Like we saw before, we had what, 12 and a quarter, 12 and 3/4, whatever it was, in between the two. That's a really tight spot, especially when you have to get ductwork and everything else up in there. And we don't need to be that close for our sheeting. Our floor decking sheeting can span longer than just that 12 inches. And 2-foot centers, so if we did every other black arrow, that would be our 2-foot centers for that. Then it's too wide. The floor would be too bouncy. So what they did was, if 16 inches on center is too small and 2 feet on center is too big, well, let's go in between. So what they did was they took 8 feet, that's how long an OSB sheet is for the floor, and they said, we'll take that and we'll divide it by 5. So that is 19.2. That is where these little diamonds come from. But you can't read, I'm going to flip this over so we can see this better. You can't read 19.2 on your tape measure. That's not an increment of a 16th. So that's why they put the diamonds. So here's a diamond and here's a diamond, okay? Now, don't forget, those marks are going to be our centers of our board. So since the diamonds are not on a 16th, it's very hard to fall back the appropriate amount. So what I do is I just go to the nearest inch and I'll fall back the 1 3/4 that I need, or fall forward 1 3/4, okay? And that is where my layout will start from. Now I'll put the nail there. So with that nail in there, I can now hook it, and now I can just mark every diamond, and I don't have to try to fall back some weird number from the diamond. Now I just mark the diamonds and go. And let's not forget that that mark is the edge of the stud, and the X marks where the stud goes. So don't put it over here because there's no X here. It's going to go over here. That mark always marks the edge of a stud. Okay, so I lost some footage here, but it doesn't have to be the edge of a stud, but an edge of whatever you are laying out. And even though when laying out something on center, you could fall forward with your line or backward, the standard is to fall back and then place an X. I don't know anyone who falls forward and puts an X behind the line. They either mark and go, meaning fall back and then make an X on the side of the line in the direction they are going, or they mark both sides of the X, which is something I will do if I'm laying out a wall for a new framer. Okay, back to 16 inches on center to clarify some things. Okay, so I'm back at the splice where one board ended and another one started. And if I lay out where this stud is, obviously I wouldn't need a tape measure, it's right there when it's lined up with this mark. Okay, so that's one stud and a half on, half off each board. Okay, so if I wanted to lay this out, I could go from this center mark and lay it out going 16, falling back 3/4 like I should, or I could slide this one over. I could, oh, there's a nail still on that side. I could slide this one over, line it up, and you can see that even though this has half of a stud here, and the beginning of this one had a full stud, my mark is still the same going down this whole one. So I could line these two plates up and mark them all using the old marks. So I wouldn't have to pull the tape again, because even though this one's half on and this one's full, this one is closer to this than that one, so it's smaller because the sheet starts here, not here. So it's the same as the starting one as it is for one in the middle. So the only mark that would be different is the starting one, because our sheet starts center on this stud, just like it does starts on the start of our whole wall. So it ends in the same spot as the other one. A lot of people think the layout on each one is different. I just wanted to point out that they are actually the same other than the starting position. So I need to clarify that an OSB sheet doesn't need to land on a splice, but it does need to land on a stud, either fully or halfway on. just as a splice always needs to land on the center of a stud or fully on the stud if it's the end or beginning of a run. For 16 inches on center, the biggest mistake I see new framers make is that they don't fully understand the meaning. And whether they pull from the start or from a stud, they always fall back 3/4 of an inch and make a mark. You only fall back if you are pulling from the start. So if this is my tape measure, I only fall back if I'm here. Here's my center, and I fall back to 3/4 to make my mark. If I am pulling anywhere else other than a splice or a start, and I hook my stud and go, all the studs I mark from then on are going to be directly on the 16-inch center marks. The only time you fall back are at the start of a run, or if you were on a splice, which has to fall halfway on the stud. If I pull from the splice and go over, then again I would fall back to 1, 2, 3/4 of an inch for the stud. Okay, so I want to cover one more area where on center can help you. Say you have a bunch of pipes coming out of the wall and you want to put some paneling over it, and you need to mark out on a sheet where those pipes are. So you can measure from the edge of your wall to the first pipe. And let's say this is 2 inches here. You can just take your measurement and add 1 inch and you'll have this measurement right here. Okay? Once you have that, you don't have to try to measure to here, add an inch, measure here, add an inch, or worse if the pipes are some weird measurement, adding weird measurements to each other. You can take this measurement, let's say this is 15, and then you can just measure from this part of the pipe to this part of the pipe. And let's say you have 12 inches, you can just mark on your sheet the 15 inches that you had over, then measure over 12 inches, and that will be the center. Because from here to here is 12 inches, that means from here to the center mark of this one is also 12 inches. Then you can do the same, measure from here to here, and let's say this is 11 inches. That means from the center of this one to the center of this one is 11 inches. So you don't have to try to pull your tape at where you think about the center is and kind of think about there's center there, so you can know exactly where it is, because just like on the studs, from any part of one to the same part on the next, whatever that dimension is, that will be the same from the center to center. If you can understand this and apply it, there are a bunch of scenarios with it where this is applicable, especially for circles of unknown diameters. But it also works if you're hanging a picture. The 2 hooks on the back, if you can't find the exact center, let's say they have a weird shape from one part to the other part, is exactly the same as their center to the center. I hope this video gives you a better understanding of what the term on center means. It was never fully explained to me when I started framing. I was told what to do a lot, and it was never explained to why I was doing what I was doing, which, needless to say, led to a lot of mistakes. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to give this video a like, as it really helps out the channel, and consider subscribing so you don't miss out on future videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Oh, I like that!